The snow fell gently, covering the deserted streets of a small mountain village. Christmas bells chimed in the distance, but silence prevailed in that forgotten corner. Lying beside an old cabin, Fred, a shepherd dog with intense brown eyes and matted fur, panted in agony. His breath was labored, and his eyes fixed on the illuminated window of the house, as if waiting for something. Inside, Anna, an elderly woman, struggled against the pain in her chest. The oxygen in her portable tank was starting to fail, and her phone had no signal. The loneliness of Christmas night made the atmosphere even more suffocating. Fred seemed to sense his owner's despair. He was not just a dog but the last thread of hope on that cold and deadly night. Outside, the wind picked up, and the snow piled into drifts. Fred rose with difficulty, shaking his head as if making a decision. His eyes showed determination. He knew he had to act. Fred had come into Anna's life during a time of pain and loneliness. 2 years earlier, while walking through the woods near her home, she heard a muffled cry coming from a ditch covered in leaves and dry branches. Curious, she pushed aside the brush and found a thin, injured puppy trembling from the cold. His brown eyes shone through the dirt, pleading for help. Without hesitation, Anna took him home, fed him, and treated his wounds. From that day on, Fred became an inseparable part of her life. The village where Anna lived was small, with fewer than 300 inhabitants. Isolated by the mountains, she lived in a simple cabin, inherited from her late husband. She was a strong woman who had learned to cope with loneliness, but Fred's presence transformed her days. He was more than a companion. He was the reason she still smiled. Anna talked to Fred as if he were human. In the mornings, while making coffee, she would share stories of her youth. In the afternoons, they walked together around the cabin, and at night, they sat near the fireplace while the sound of the wind echoed outside. Fred seemed to understand every word, responding with attentive gazes and indescribable affection. In recent months, however, Anna had begun to feel the weight of her age. Her legs were weaker, and respiratory attacks had become frequent. Even so, she insisted on living alone, refusing help from her family who lived in another city. To her, Fred was enough. He seemed to anticipate her moments of struggle, lying by her side when she felt ill and bringing small objects, like her inhaler or even her scarf, whenever she showed signs of fatigue. That Christmas Eve, Anna prepared for a quiet night. She had decorated her small cabin with twinkling lights, hung stockings by the fireplace, and made a simple cake. "This will be our Christmas, Fred," she said, stroking his head. The dog, lying at her feet, responded with a gentle wag of his tail, as if understanding the significance of the moment. But the calm of the night was shattered by a sudden respiratory attack. Anna tried to reach for her oxygen tank, but her vision began to darken, and her hands trembled. Fred immediately realized something was wrong. He ran in circles, barking, as if trying to call for help. But the cabin was isolated, and the snow outside had turned the road into an impassable path. As Anna fought to stay conscious, Fred started nudging the inhaler with his nose, but it wasn't enough. He stopped and looked at her, as if asking for permission to leave. Anna, with almost superhuman effort, raised a trembling hand and murmured, "Go, Fred. Help." The dog hesitated for a moment, as if aware of the risk of leaving her alone, but something in his eyes changed. He knew it was the only chance. With one last glance at his owner, he stepped through the open door, braving the snow and biting cold. Fred was not just a pet. He was a guardian, a loyal friend, and now, a spark of hope amidst the darkness of that night. As Anna lost strength inside the cabin, Fred ran through the frozen trail, determined to complete the mission that could save his best friend. With the oxygen tank quickly running out and Anna too weak to seek help, Fred sprang into action. He knew he needed to find someone, but how? The snow was already reaching his paws, and the cutting wind made him shiver. Still, he pressed on toward the forest, guided by instinct. The road to the village was covered in ice. Fred ran non-stop, even as his paws became raw from the frost. Every step was a challenge, but he kept going, driven by the thought of saving his owner. Meanwhile, in the village, Marcos, a young firefighter, was finishing his night shift. He was about to head home when he heard a faint sound outside the station, a bark, insistent and filled with desperation. Intrigued, he opened the door and saw Fred, exhausted and covered in snow. The dog grabbed at the hem of his pants with force, trying to pull him along. Marcos, sensing the urgency of the situation, grabbed his rescue equipment and followed Fred down the trail. The path to the cabin was a true test of endurance for both Fred and Marcos. The snow fell heavier, and the cold made every step a struggle. Despite being exhausted, Fred did not stop. His now labored barks guided Marcos along the nearly invisible trail. Holding his flashlight tightly, Marcos could only make out the shadow of the dog ahead, moving with an unusual determination. When they finally saw the cabin, the faint light in the window looked like a star in the middle of nowhere. Fred bolted ahead, slipping on the snow as he reached the door. He barked desperately and began scratching at it with his paws, as if trying to tear it down. Marcos quickly caught up and pushed the door open. Inside, the scene was bleak. Anna lay collapsed beside her armchair, her skin pale and lips blue. The empty oxygen tank lay beside her, and her breathing was barely perceptible. Fred ran to her, licking her face and letting out low whimpers, as if begging her to wake up. Marcos acted fast. He pulled a portable oxygen tank from his backpack, connected the mask to Anna's face, and adjusted the oxygen flow. For a few seconds that felt like an eternity, the room was oppressively silent. Marcos watched Anna's chest, waiting for the slightest sign of movement. Fred lay beside her, his head resting on her hand, his eyes fixed on her face as if trying to transfer his strength to her. Then, finally, Anna took a deep breath, the dry sound breaking the silence like a note of hope. Her eyes slowly opened, blinking in confusion. "Fred," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The dog let out a soft bark, as if to say, "I'm here." But the danger was far from over. Anna was extremely weak, and Marcos knew he needed to get her out of there immediately. He radioed in to report a critical patient and requested transportation, despite the road being nearly impassable. Fred, even exhausted, stood up and began circling Marcos, as if to say he was ready to help in any way he could. Carrying Anna through the snow would be difficult, but there was no other option. Marcos improvised a stretcher with what he could find in the cabin, wrapping Anna in blankets to shield her from the cold. As he pulled the stretcher along the trail, Fred walked beside him, keeping a close eye on her every movement. The snow made progress difficult, and there were moments when Marcos almost gave up. But whenever he stopped to rest, Fred would come and press his nose against Marcos's hands, as if to say, "Keep going. We're close." After hours of exhausting effort, they finally reached the village entrance, where a medical team was already waiting for them. Anna was taken to an improvised health center, and Fred, despite being exhausted and having injured paws, refused to leave her side. He stayed next to the stretcher while the doctors worked, watching every movement as if protecting his owner. When Anna finally opened her eyes and could breathe more easily, the first thing she saw was Fred. With a faint smile, she murmured, "You're my hero." The dog, as if understanding her words, gently licked her hand, his ears finally perking up in relief. In that moment, everyone in the room realized they weren't just witnessing the rescue of a woman but an extraordinary story of love and loyalty that would touch their hearts forever. The days following the rescue brought warmth and emotion to the small village, where the story of Fred and Anna quickly spread. While Anna recovered at the local health center, Fred remained by her side, refusing to leave, even neglecting his meals. He lay next to her bed, his eyes vigilant and full of love, as if knowing his presence was essential to her recovery. The doctors and nurses were amazed by the bond between the two. When Anna touched Fred's head, her anxiety seemed to fade, and her heart rate stabilized. "This dog is more than a pet," said one emotional nurse. "He's part of her soul." On the third day, Anna was well enough to walk to the small common area of the health center. There, she was greeted with a surprise. The villagers had gathered to celebrate Fred's heroic act. Children brought posters with drawings of the dog, while adults carried food and blankets to help them through the challenging days ahead. "He's not just my hero," Anna said, moved, her voice still weak. "Fred is a reminder that love and loyalty can overcome any obstacle, no matter how difficult." Fred, ever attentive, wagged his tail at hearing his owner's words, but he maintained his dignified demeanor, as if aware that all the attention was deserved, not out of vanity, but because he had fulfilled his duty. The days of recovery passed quickly, and soon Anna was able to return to her cabin. This time, however, things were different. The village wouldn't allow her to remain isolated again. Neighbors began taking turns visiting her, bringing supplies, medication, and companionship. Fred also received gifts: a new blanket, a special collar with a medal engraved with the words, "Christmas Hero," and, of course, plenty of treats. But none of that seemed to matter to him. Fred remained as he had always been, by Anna's side, following her every move, ready to protect her again if needed. On New Year's Eve, Anna, now fully recovered, sat on the porch of her cabin with Fred by her side. The sky was clear, and the stars shone brightly. She held his muzzle in her hands and looked deeply into his eyes. "You saved me, my friend. And it wasn't just my life, you saved my heart. Thank you for being my miracle." Fred responded with a gentle wag of his tail and sat beside her, as he always did when showing affection. Together, they stayed there in silence, sharing a connection that words could never describe. Fred's actions not only saved Anna but also transformed the dynamics of the entire village, which began to support one another more and cherish the small things, like a dog's loyalty and the invisible bonds that connect us. On that starlit night, Fred wasn't just a hero. He was a symbol of hope, love, and the true spirit of Christmas. On that Christmas night, Fred not only saved Anna's life but reminded everyone of the true essence of the holiday: love, sacrifice, and hope. To many, he was just a dog, but to Anna, he was a miracle in the guise of a four-legged friend. And you, have you ever wondered what you would do for your best friend? Sometimes, it's in the silence of a cold night that the greatest love stories unfold.